again, astronauts. Today, we will be interviewing Freddy Purnell. Freddy Purnell is a research assistant at the University of Pennsylvania and a commissioner at the PA Commission on LGBTQ Affairs. As you can probably guess, they're here to talk about bees. Hey, Freddy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, we'll get into your current research as a research assistant a little bit later, but during your undergraduate, you did research focused on bumblebees. So, what do I need to know about bumblebees?
There's a lot you should know about bumblebees. So one issue we have when we're framing our research is that most people, when they think about bees, they're thinking about honeybees. When bumblebees are very different from honeybees as a model organism. So one of the things that make bees cool is that they're one of the few groups that experience eusociality. And eusociality is defined by three major characteristics. The overlap of generations, so there's multiple generations of organisms living in the same group, a reproductive division of labor, so there's a reproductive caste, in bees' case, the queen, and a non-reproductive caste, the workers, and the third is mutual care of offspring. So all of the workers contribute to taking care of the offspring, even if they're not related to them. But there's actually a range of eusociality found in all organisms, but specifically in bees. So honeybees are known as an advanced eusocial organism, whereas bumblebees are called primitively eusocial, which means that they do experience all three of those. But one of the cool things is that the bumblebee colony actually goes through phases. And one of the cool phases that part of our research was based around is the competition phase. So in honeybees, the queen is always producing eggs and is the only one that produces eggs because the queen is morphologically distinct from the rest of the workers. But in bumblebees, that's not the case. The queen is exactly the same as the workers, except she's 3 times as large. So all of the workers in the bumblebee colonies, specifically in bombus and patients, when we studied, are reproductively capable. And if you remove them from the queen, they'll actually start laying eggs. So in the competition phase in bumblebees, the queen continues laying eggs, but so do the workers. So they'll all compete to produce males, which is a really different experience than looking at a honeybee colony where all the offspring came from the queen.
How does a bumblebee colony get through the competition phase? How do they duke it out to see who gets to be queen and gets to be giant?
Yeah. So, the queens are determined at birth. So at the end of the competition phase, the queen will lay eggs that are known as gines, and they're huge. So if the worker eggs are this big, the queen's ones are this big. I don't know if you can actually see that, but they're 3 times the size of the normal ones. So those ones will become queens. But what they do is they compete to lay male eggs, because since the worker ones don't actually mate with the drones, all of their eggs are unfertilized, and the unfertilized ones develop into males. And the reason they do this is because of how, one of the theories is because of how population genetics work out, the workers would be more related to their own male offspring than they would be to the queen's male offspring, because they're 100% related to their sons, but only about 75% related to their brothers. So how they get through the competition phase is they really don't. While honeybee colonies can last for years at a time, bumblebee colonies last 1 year. And at the end, there's the revolt phase where the workers actually kill the queen.
Viva la revolution!
Yes, very much channel French Revolution realness. And they kill their queen, but because only the gines and the queens have the fat stores necessary to get through the winter, they also die when they get frozen out. Only her gines survive. They leave the colony. So the queen lays the eggs that develop into giants, that develop into queens themselves, they leave to go find other males to mate with and start a colony with.
Okay.
And so they will find like a hole in the ground somewhere and like hibernate through the winter because they can survive it. But the old colonies, they're all dead.
So what you're saying is that the queen bee is hoarding all of these fat reserves for herself. The other bees realize, oh, we're not going to survive the winter because we have no fat stores because this greedy queen is stealing them all. Let's rise up with our fellow comrade bees. You have a bunch of comrade bees trying to overthrow the queen, but it doesn't matter because the climate is changing and they're all going to die off. So only the children of the royalty survive. Like the revolution is bloody. We've still like dispatched the queen bee. Mm-hmm. But the queen bee's offspring survive to institute another feudal system.
Yes.
The next year. So the revolution is not in vain, except that it is because winter is coming. So I can't think of a possible allegory that could be related to. Nope.
Yeah.
That's just bee specific.
But yeah, yep. And so the giants, the rest of the bumblebee colony is pretty standard. The bee goes after it hibernates in the winter. Usually, bumblebees make their hives in the ground, so they don't like make them out of wax like honeybees do. Bumblebees make them in the ground. So the queen hibernates for the winter. She emerges in spring, and then having already mated with a male, because the males also don't survive the winter, and then she starts laying worker eggs. And then they build a new colony. And then that colony is fated to revolt against their queen too. And the queen is not a benevolent ruler. So one of the ways she maintains control is that if she will punish any bee that she catches stepping out of line. So like I said, the workers are capable of laying eggs. But if the queen catches you laying eggs, she'll bite you, she'll sting you, and she'll consume the eggs you laid so that she gets that nutrients back.
Wow. I feel like, sign me up. Like, I'm ready to be a comrade bee. This queen sounds awful.
It definitely doesn't surprise me that there is definitely that breakdown in the relationship.
Yeah.
And so, because being a worker bee doesn't sound like the best life.
No, it sounds terrible. I can totally understand being a worker bee. And it's like, well, I'm not going to survive the winter. So at least I'm going to take you out with me.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely the coolest difference between bumblebees and honeybees. There's a lot of other differences, like bumblebees, their stingers aren't as big, and they don't have that barb that honeybees have that allow them that kill them when they sting. So bumblebees, as I've learned many times, can sting multiple times.
I did have a neighbor growing up who used to like catch bumblebees like this in his hands. Was he being super dangerous, or are bumblebees just generally chiller than most bees? Because I remember when he would catch the bumblebees, generally they wouldn't sting him.
Well, from my understanding, most bees tend to get aggressive when the colony is in danger. So if you're not near their colonies, there's very little reason for them to sting you. It's also possible, because there are some species of stingless bees out there, and I don't know where you're growing up, but it's possible that the bumblebees there are more docile, don't have stingers in the first place, because there's a very diverse thing of bees in America. Oh, that's another really interesting thing. So wait,
there are different species of bumblebees?
Yeah, there's tons. So in Pennsylvania alone, like we did Bombus impatiens was our research mechanism. There's also Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is like the main bumblebee species in Pennsylvania, and there's tons of them. We're not going to list off different bumblebee species, but there's all across America. They diversified in different states. And that's actually one of the other interesting things about bumblebees, because bumblebees are endemic to the United States. Honeybees are a non-native species. Honeybees are found in Africa, Europe, and Asia, but we actually, but they were brought here when people came to colonize America, the honeybees. So they're actually a non-native species.
Please name every species of bee ever. You have 30 seconds. Go. Second, do honeybees and bumblebees compete over resources? Like, we don't really think of honeybees as an invasive species. Like, there's all this save the bee stuff, and they're talking about honeybees. Are honeybees generally good for the environment that they're in, or are they more like a negative invasive species?
Whether or not honeybees are invasive or not is a very hotly contested subject in ecology. And I, the person who was an undergraduate researcher, don't have the range qualifications and also don't want the smoke of getting into that debate right now.
So what you're saying is that if I want to start a fight, like just fisticuffs, like epic battle, I go into an ecology conference and just casually be like, so are honeybees invasive? And just like take a few steps back to watch the fireworks.
That might start a rumble.
Note to all of my viewers, go to the nearest ecology conference, shout, are honeybees an invasive species? And then just like get to the side of the room and like pretend somebody else yelled it. And if you can, get footage, send it to me for science reasons.
Of course. So there is some competition that goes on, and there are places where honeybees do push out bumblebees, and there's like studies that are looking into like how bad that can be. Also, you got to think about bees are very like any pollinator. Bees co-evolve along with the flowers they pollinate. So a lot of American wildflowers actually have this mechanism called the buzz law. So bumblebees, when they're pollinating a lot of American wildflowers, will actually vibrate at a frequency that is necessary for the plants, those flowers, to release their pollen. And honeybees can't pollinate those flowers. But since we also have brought in a lot of European flowers over here, there are also ones that honeybees pollinate a lot better and more effectively than bumblebees do. So, especially with economic reasons too, there are a lot of things that we like that honeybees provide that bumblebees don't. The namesake, bumblebees don't make honey. So people like honeybees. There's definitely a dynamic, but there are also flowers that exist that both species are better at pollinating than each other. So once again, I'm not one qualified to say if one is better, but I will say that there is definitely an equilibrium with how humans have modified the florosphere, if that's a word, of the Americas, where both bumblebees and honeybees are necessary at this point in time.
That's really interesting. So we brought in honeybees, but we also brought in everything they pollinate. So honeybees are kind of just a small piece of this legacy of colonization on the biosphere.
Yeah, and both are helpful. I mean, I like honey, so I enjoy having honeybees around, but if I am team bumblebee because I am research bumblebees, I work with them, and they're really cute. I like bumblebees.
Bumblebees are so cute. Like they are way cuter than honeybees. And
yeah, I like fuzzy bees.
They're so fuzzy and cute. Oh my God. And the way they like fly around, they shouldn't be able to fly. They're so big and they just kind of bobble.
Nature finds a way.
Yeah. So what was your research project with the bees? What did you do?
Before I dive into specifically what I did, let's take a step back and think about like what the goal was. So as we mentioned earlier, save the bees is very important. And so one thing we worked with is pesticides. When people spray pesticides, they're trying to kill species that hurt crops like grasshoppers, ball weevils, aphids, that sort of thing. And so when you're looking at a pesticide to make sure it's effective, you want to make sure it's not harming those pollinators. And so one thing people look at when you're using a pesticide is if it's killing those pollinators. But we know that's not the only way you can cause a colony to collapse. So sure, if the pesticide doesn't kill the bees at the concentration you're spraying it, it might still change their behavior or change them molecularly and cause them to not reproduce, cause them to not eat, cause them to have incompatible mating behaviors, which then makes it impossible for them to continue propagating their colonies, which will lead to an indirect collapse. So the research I did was looking at the effects that certain pesticides had on the feeding and mating habits of bumblebees. And so my old PI, Dr. Anselm, had recently had looked at these in Bombus terrestris, which is a species of bumblebee native to Israel, if I remember correctly. So I was reproducing them in bombus impatiens.
So you were making sure that the results that worked for one species worked for a different species.
Exactly. When you're looking at stuff like that, species have differences at both the genetic level, and those genetic levels differences in their genotype can cause different phenotypes, which can change their expression for their ability to process toxins, their entire mating ritual. So like bombus impatiens have a very different way of mating than like other bees, like osmia do. Even honeybees have a different style of mating. So it's just very important that these things are consistent across all the bees that could potentially be impacted by the pesticide. Because if you're spraying in an area, you're not just going to hit one species, you're going to hit every species in that area. So it's important that it's not hurting any of them.
And you want to maintain that biodiversity because you want to keep all of the species happy and healthy because you need as many bees as you can get.
Exactly.
Okay, so could you discuss what you're currently doing for research? So you're no longer an undergrad, you're now a research assistant. You're very early in your career. What are your current projects?
Yeah, so I've taken a complete 180. I went from working with primarily behavioral assays on an insect model organism to studying human microglia and brain disease models. So,
wait, you said that honeybees was going to be cooler. This is awesome.
well, I'm an evolutionary biologist at heart, and I love insects. So that is cooler is relative. So that's where my passion lies. But actually, the stuff I'm doing right now is really cool. So the lab I work with is the Bennett lab, and basically our research is around my boss, Frederick Bennett, basically discovered a way that you can do a bone marrow transplant to repopulate microglia in the brain after they have been lost. And so microglia are the resident macrophages of the brain. So basically think about them, they're the white blood cells for your brain.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I should have discussed what a microglia was.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what is a microglia? So they're like the white blood cells for your immune system, but for your brain?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of diseases and things that can cause you to basically lose them. And so his research is all about this transplantation model and the way we can use it to help people in a variety of diseases.
So this isn't brain injuries, this is brain diseases.
Yeah.
Okay. So your brain gets a disease. It loses a bunch of its microglia, which are the immune system for the brain. And then this guy found a way to take some of your bones and put it in your brain and fix your brain.
Well, if you think about it, our white blood cells are derived from bone marrow. And so the progenitors can infiltrate and basically repopulate the niche.
I just love this because this seems very Star Trek. Like, do you happen to work for the emergency medical hologram? Like, is that like this seems like such a Star Trekian like answer. Like, oh, I'm gonna take a piece of his bone, slap it in his brain, and now he's all better.
Right now, our model is all in mice.
Okay.
So, yes, we're all in mice right now. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of other like research about this model to make sure that it can be translationally relevant.
So do you get to work with the mice?
Yeah, I work with mice, so I'm very new to it, and it's a very different like environment than working with. I went from an invertebrate species to a vertebrate species. And so one thing that's very different is like bees have, like a lot of insects have hemolymph. So when I was doing like injections of pesticides into bees, you can really do it anywhere and it will eventually diffuse throughout the entire bee. But I don't know if your viewers know, but mammals, we have these things called veins, and veins are very small. And it's a lot harder to work with them.
I really like how you pegged my average user as not being sure what a vein is. Like, this is very much a physics channel, and I thank you for coming to my level. I'm like, oh yeah, veins. They're in your body somewhere, right? Those exist.
I had to get to the same level because I was like, oh yeah, bones are a thing that animals that people study have to deal with. Because like a lot of the things I'd researched like throughout my undergrad career were invertebrates. So you're like working with something, you're like, oh yeah, bone marrow. That's definitely something that happens in animals because insects don't have bones.
Yep. So you are a commissioner on the Pennsylvania Commission on LGBTQ Affairs. So the Pennsylvania Commission on LGBTQ Affairs was established by an executive order from Governor Tom Wolf back in August of 2018. Its goal is to advise the governor and state agencies regarding policies, programs, and legislation that impact LGBTQ communities and to serve as a resourceful intermediary between LGBTQ communities and state government. It is composed of appointed commissioners from across the Commonwealth, each acting as a representative and advocate for LGBTQ communities. So, how did you become one of the commissioners?
One thing I'm also really passionate about is doing work for marginalized communities. Pretty obviously, I'm a member of multiple marginalized communities. I'm queer, I'm African American. So one thing that came very apparent to me at Penn State, because I grew up in Philadelphia, so very diverse community here. But going to Penn State, especially the main campus, it's located in the middle of State College, which is, if you know anything about Pennsylvania, in a sea of rural communities. So it was a very different environment. And so one thing that became very apparent to me during my freshman year of college was that there wasn't as easy for me to throw myself into the sciences as my peers were, because I was dealing with other forms of bias coming from not just the internal community at Penn State, but also the external community around State College. So during that time, I started getting more involved in like learning about that, and eventually got very big into, after I learned a lot during my junior and senior year, got very big into advocating on behalf of queer and trans students and Black students specifically. And through that work, I started making a lot of connections. I got very well known in the Penn State community, which led me to getting appointed to the State College Borough's LGBTQ Affairs office, and worked with and using them. And also I became the president of a bunch of queer organizations. And through my working within the Penn State community and the surrounding communities, I also met and networked and met with queer orgs through the surrounding Pennsylvania community. And through those connections and the work I did at Penn State, I was recommended to be added to it by one of my mentors who also served on as a member. And then I got appointed.
Nice. That's awesome. It's really cool how you kind of worked your way up and really learned and started advocating for that community. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, it also changed my whole career trajectory. I always told people, if you asked me what I wanted to do in high school, I wanted to have a TV show on National Geographic. And I love talking about that. But then growing in that environment and seeing a lot of the barriers that I had to overcome, and a lot of people like me had to get as far as it. I wanted, now my hopeful career goal is to become a dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion to help make that transition to the next generation of Black queer scientists don't have to face the same issues that I had to try and become one.
I love that. And I think one thing that's very prevalent in academia, especially in the sciences, are professors and administrators, basically everybody who's been there a while, who are like, oh, we're STEM people. There's no way we could have bias. We're used to being objective. So, how could we possibly have any bias? We only care about, insert these numbers things here. Did you find that was at all true in STEM?
No, no one is completely free of bias. And a lot of people think that they're free from it just because they're in certain career fields, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. But also there's historical issues. So one thing I talk about, I'm an evolutionary biologist. So I took a lot of evolutionary biology classes. And so you're reading one of the foundational thinkers like Carl Linnaeus, and on page 120, he's talking about like how we can define species based off these characteristics, right? And then on page 125, he's saying, and using these characteristics, you can tell that Africans are animals and not real and not people. Thus, we can discriminate against them.
Yep,
And
that's
so,
still taught in college classes.
well, and so like it's the fact that like there's a lot of people who have like, sure, the leaps they've made have helped the scientific community a lot, but a lot of their advancements have been made on like the backs of Black and brown people, or have been made to as an excuse to further marginalize us. So yes, like he's an important person to talk about in evolutionary biology, but the fact that like, and while we didn't necessarily need to read that chapter, I liked reading textbooks. And so you're reading stuff and then you see this like, oh, this is on the stuff that wasn't assigned to us. And like, no one wants to address it. But in my opinion, a lot of problems I faced were coming from we're not talking about what were some of the thought processes that came from this that are still being used and implemented in the way we do like public policy. Because like evolutionary biology is my passion, I love it. But even though a lot of the people didn't advocate, we can't ignore the fact that the field of eugenics did spring from it.
Yep.
So stuff like that is important, and not everyone knows how to have those conversations. And I think that those conversations in STEM are very important. Every field has its issues, but I think it's especially if you're in the biological sciences, because if you look at the history of America, a lot of discrimination has been based in quote unquote biology and biological essentialism.
And it's funny because they're all like, oh, well, these people made such great advances. They were so objective. They were able to look at the world. And you look at it and you're like, oh, well, they said a bunch of very racist things and like did a bunch of very terrible things. And a lot of their science was used for things that we've decided are bad. And it's clear that they came from a context, a societal context that was super racist, super sexist, super homophobic, altogether awful. And the reaction should probably be, okay, well, let's analyze it. Let's realize that they came from this context, so their views were biased in this way. Instead, it's very like, oh, we're just gonna like ignore the racist bit. We're not gonna take it out of the textbook. We're just not gonna assign the racist bit. But we're gonna just take everything else as fact. Like, we're not gonna take all of it with a grain of salt. We are like, the entire way of approaching science from a lot of these foundational texts was clouded by the society of the time. And I think that kind of wanting to push like this little bit that's obviously terrible under the rug, it really allows for other harmful ideologies to kind of slip in with there. Like, you can say, oh, this bit was super racist. Let's ignore that. Okay, moving on. And then 20 years later, oh, this bit was super homophobic. Let's bury that. You like, oh, this bit was super sexist. Let's bury that. But now you still have something that might be incredibly ableist. Like, there's so many layers.
And I'm not saying that you shouldn't teach these people, because I'm never going to take away the advancements we have for them. I think it's important for us to have these conversations. Those are the two big things. Like, even interpersonally, there's also a lack of Black scientists. We know that. So in general, so it's very hard to see yourself in that role, because not many of the professors you are look like you. I wanted to be a scientist since I was a kid, and I've never had a Black science teacher. It's really hard to like visualize yourself in that role when every time you see a scientist, they don't look like you. A bunch of small things like that kind of like pile up. But there's also a lot of overt, just not coming from the STEM department, but surrounding these institutions. Because like, I went to college in 2016, so it was my freshman year. So there were a lot of people who were being very bold and brash about their views on what people should be allowed in the country. And so that's just stuff that distracts you when you're a student. So all these factors came in and made me realize that like I couldn't just like fully come in and devote myself to the sciences like so many other people could, because I was dealing with a lot of emotional like and a lot of environmental factors that were like distracting my education, my attention. And so I wanted to see if I could try and change that.
Yeah. And for anybody watching who has doubts that like racism is shown to dramatically harm student progress and like psychological damage can affect grades. Like you can easily look up like scientific studies. You can Google them. They exist in spades. But think about how we identify bullying at the high school level. Like if a student is being bullied, one of the obvious signs is that their grades start to slip. And bullying is a thing that gets taken very seriously at the middle and high school level. Now imagine everyone in the world is a bully. How do you think that student will do?
There are a lot of good people at Penn State. Like I loved my time there. The lab I joined was super supportive of everything I did. Like from everything being the fact that like there would be days where I'd be like, hey, sorry, I can't come. Can someone check on my colonies today? Because I'm going to sit in on this person's office and go to a meeting to talk about this issue that's going on. And they'd always be like, sure, like you're really good. I would run off for events and stuff because I ended up being busy. So, and people were very understanding and like accepting of that. And so there's a lot of good people there, but yeah, it just happens.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the commission and why you view it as important, and have there been any substantial victories by the commission?
Pennsylvania as a state is very diverse. We have 4 or 5 major cities from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Scranton, and Erie. And we have a lot of rural communities as well that are like in between those. So you have a bunch of different people with varying viewpoints on everything. And one of the major things I love about being the commission is that you give people who are not only from different walks of life that come with perspectives that are all talking about queer issues, because we have some of the commissioners are lawyers and judges who come at things from a legislative and like policy angle. We have people who are community organizers or who work with the community and try to improve the material conditions in their local areas. We have people who are doctors or healthcare providers who work with the health side of things. We have people who are teachers or work in schools who are dealing with the education side of it. And you have all these people who have different perspectives all coming to give input and advice towards the governor to help and to basically help make sure that the legislation that is passing or proposed ways to better serve the unique experiences of queer folk in Pennsylvania. Because the things that I, as a queer non-binary person growing up in Philadelphia, are not necessarily the same things that a trans Black woman who grew up in Erie needs. So having people who are from all these communities who can give insight because they have the lived experience, they have the professional experience, they have the research experience, and all come together and talk about these issues, I think it's really important for not just the betterment of our community, but also the betterment of our society.
Yeah, I love that. The queer community is not a monolith, therefore you should have several representatives from all walks of life.
The governor signed an executive order that was recommended and helped drafted by members of the commission that basically expanded protections for queer folks who worked in the government. A couple thousand people have now been added that can't be discriminated against based off their gender identity or sexual orientation in Pennsylvania.
So this commission isn't just a symbol. This commission is getting concrete action done. Like this commission is drafting legislation that gets signed, or drafting executive orders that get signed.
Yeah. Also, the smaller committees will go and do things at like community levels. So we have the education community goes and works with school boards on to how to make sure that the schools are affirming and like can handle issues that involve queer and trans students.
So you mentioned earlier that growing up, you didn't ever get to see any scientists who looked like you. if there's someone among our viewers who does look like you and is looking up to you, what would be advice you would give to that viewer who wants to study science and go into science?
What I would say is that first off, don't take no for an answer. I would say keep going. So there's going to be a lot of people who are going to doubt your abilities as a scientist based off the color of your skin, and don't let that get you down. Like, yes, it's okay if it hurts. That pain is real, but if this is your dream, you got to keep going for it. And there's going to be a lot more people who affirm you at every step along the way, and make sure that you can develop into the scientist that you know you can be. And also, don't worry too much about being perfect. One of the major problems that happens, especially with members of minoritized communities, is that we're fed this notion that you need to be the perfect shining example of your community in order to exceed. And that is very unrealistic. Nobody's perfect. And it's a lot of pressure on yourself to think, oh, you need to be the perfect scientist. I've made mistakes. I've messed up a lot in my career. And you got to keep going. Like, if this is what you want to do, I would say pursuing it and making sure that you're happy is the most important thing. And you don't need to be the amazing out there next person who discovers the next CRISPR. You can just be the person who likes insects and has always liked looking at insects, who just goes and looks at bees under a microscope and just has fun, and see where your community goes and where your career goes from there. And also try stuff. Like, one of the things that I think has led me very far in my career is I said yes to every opportunity that came my way. My first research position was in high school, when my high school teacher was like, hey, I know somebody who's doing research on leukemia, and said they let a high school student shadow people in their lab. Does that interest you? I had no idea about leukemia, but I was like, sure. I wasn't interested in bees before I applied to do research on them. I was like, hey, this website, this lab sounds really cool. I want to learn about bees. And I said, sir. And now I was like, hey, this job researching brains looks really cool. I don't know anything about brains, but let me apply. And now I'm researching brains.
I love that. You're allowed to be average and follow the shiny things. Honestly,
my ADHD is very helpful in my career.
That is,
I bounce all over the place.
yeah. I mean, that is just you are like the perfect archetype of a scientist. You follow the shiny things and you just get really excited about everything. That is just the like your personality is just the archetypal scientist. Like, when I think of like everything good, bad, and silly about scientists, that is exactly you. Like, willing to be willing to make mistakes and learn from them, follow the shiny things, and just your passion and excitement exude off you, which is so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I love what I do. I tell people all the time, I love the fact that I get to sit down and learn something new every day as a career. Like, I get paid to learn, not much, but I get paid to do it. don't put that not much in there.
Oh no, we on this channel, we are very, very open about the fact that a career in academia will not pay well.
Yeah, it won't. But I enjoy it, and that's the thing. When I was thinking about what I could do in college, I was like, sure, I could go. Like, my uncle wanted me to be an engineer, and I was like, sure, I could go make a lot of money, but like, I've always loved animals, so I want to be an evolutionary biologist who gets to look at animals and gets paid somewhat to do that.
That, as someone who did the money job for a couple years and then well, obviously I'm not doing that anymore. The money is not worth selling your soul. Do what you love.
Mhm.
Think about all the money you're saving in therapy.
Oh. Uh,
Thank you so much to Freddy Purnell for coming on and talking about bees and their current research. Everybody, have a great day, and remember that science is a process. Astra out.
Ad Astra, to the stars, to the stars.